All right, good morning. Is it good morning? Early good afternoon. Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, which is nobody, I am Njelle Hamilton. I'm delighted to welcome you all, those of you here in the room, and 40 out of you apparently signed up on Zoom. Welcome to our second and final event for this academic year in the Conversations in Caribbean Studies series. This series was inaugurated by my former colleague, Njelle, and former she's past, former me. She's thriving elsewhere. In the past couple of years, we hosted book chats to celebrate Caribbean scholars from Kaya Glover to Stacey Letman, as well as listening sessions in honor of the work of Jamaican dub pioneer Lee Scratch Perry. So on behalf of the Greater Caribbean Studies Network, the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies, and Departments of English and Women and Gender Studies, I'm beyond honored to be hosting this book chat to celebrate the launch of an exquisite new book, Strolling in the Ruins by my mentor and dear friend, Faith Smith. Welcome. I'd like to think that you chose us to launch the book, but actually she didn't have a choice. We just bent her arm and brought her here. Professor Faith L. Smith is the Marta F. Kauffman Chair in African American and African Studies at Brandeis University. Her research interests are in the intellectual and cultural histories of the Caribbean and the African Diaspora from the late 19th century to the present. Her essays on intellectual life, gender, sexuality, and sovereignty include recent articles such as Fabricating Intimacies, Artificial Silk and Cloth Wives in the Interwar Moment, and Good Enough for Booker T to Kiss, Hampton, Tuskegee, and the Caribbean Self-Fashioning. The essay collection, Sex and the Citizen, Interrogating the Caribbean, and of course, newly released Strolling in the Ruins, the Caribbean's Non-Sovereign Modern in the Early 20th Century. She's already at work on a new project, tentatively titled Dreadkin, which examines visual culture, the texture of Blackness on canvas, in the work of artists such as Philip Thomas, Kelly Snappberry, and Toyi Odutola, for example, and fiction of the last decade. And she's asking how do Caribbean's descendants of enslavement and indenture weigh the claims of memory, desire, kinship, and prosperity in our contemporary global moment. And our respondent today is my dear colleague, Matthew Chin, who's an assistant professor in the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department here at UVA. He's an interdisciplinary scholar of race, history, gender, and sexuality, trained in anthropology and social work. His book project, really exciting work, called Queer Fractals, Making Histories of Repair in Modern Jamaica, proposes queer fractals as a theory and method of history making. This book is forthcoming from Duke in 2024. Queer Fractals synthesizes Caribbean and North Atlantic genealogies of queer to reference race, gendered, and sexual alterity, and weds into the concept of fractals, a kind of geometry in which patterns repeat inexactly. Queer Fractals proposes a politics of reparations that extends existing discourses of overcoming the past and calculating economic compensation for survivors of violence. I can't wait to have a book chat about this in the coming years. Chin's work has been published in Public Culture, Interventions, Time and Society, Small Acts, and others. And his research has been funded by the Social Science and Humanities Council of Canada and supported by fellowships the Department of Sociology, Columbia, the Center for Sexuality, Race, and Gender Justice at Kent, and the Center for Black, Brown, and Queer Studies. Thank you so much for agreeing to be our respondent today, Matthew Chin. Before I sit down, I'll give you a preview of how we proceed today. So Matthew will introduce the book and then engage Faith in the discussion until about 1. And then we'll open up for questions from our audience. So those of you on Zoom, please use the Q&A function. And I'll come around and read them aloud later. If you do have to log off before we end, You can watch the recording later for the answers. We are recording the session and we'll post it on our Woodson YouTube channel. After the Q&A, we'll have books for sale in the back of the room and Faith will sign copies. And then you're welcome to join us for lunch next door in 107 Minor Hall. So without further ado, Matthew and Faith.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this rainy Friday afternoon. I'm both humbled and excited to be the respondent for our visiting scholar, Dr. Faith Smith, in speaking with her about her new book, Strolling in the Ruins, The Caribbean's Non-Sovereign Modern in the Early 20th Century. In the time we have today, as Dr. Hamilton indicated, I'm going to give a brief overview of the book and share some of my impressions before turning to questions and then opening up the space for comments and questions from our audience. I'd also like to give a big thanks to friend and colleague Njelle for doing all the heavy lifting and coordinating this event. So thank you. In Strolling in the Ruins, Faith Smith directs her attention to what she refers to as the quiet period in the late 19th century and early 20th century Anglophone Caribbean. It is difficult to see this era as significant in Anglophone Caribbean history because it is overshadowed by the fervor of resistance on either side, sitting between the anti-slavery revolts that take place earlier and the era of nationalism to come. Even within this period, Anglophone territories appear orderly and stable, fading into the background against the much more visible political struggles in Haiti, characterized by unrest that leads to US occupation in 1915, and the Hispanic Caribbean with the Spanish-American War in 1898. If this period goes missing in the search for narratives of dissent, what kinds of frameworks are necessary to make it visible? This question is very much informed by the sentiments of the present, the feeling of having outlived the future. Smith seems to be saying, given the undeniability of Caribbean non-sovereignty, despite half a millennium of struggle, how might it be useful to take a different approach? She asks, and I'm quoting from page 2, what happens when we cannot prove resistance without a doubt? When resistance seems less interesting as a goal or disposition than other aspects of a spectacular event, or when, without other kinds of legibility, all we have is quiet. By turning to the seemingly obscure and nondescript in Trinidad and Jamaica in particular, Smith asks us to think of quiet not in terms of static silence, but rather in terms of a stifling violence, a violence that is slow, routine, and mundane. This space of quiet functions as a site of self-reflection as Anglophone Caribbean people watch and assess themselves in relationship to the workings of European colonialism and US imperialism. What do we think about the pivot of European powers to direct rule in Africa and Asia as the US increasingly gains power in our own backyards? Where do we stand and where do we want to stand amidst these global power shifts? Chapter 1 directly speaks to these questions by using Cuba's Third War of Independence, the Spanish-American War, and the Boer War to consider what it might mean to see Cuba from Jamaica and see South Africa from Trinidad at the opening of the 20th century. In this quiet people, Caribbean people imagine power and freedom from within and not against the existing order of things, as evidenced in the transition from President Henri Christophe into King Henry of the Kingdom of Haiti. The aspiration is for imperial power, royalty, and the authority of office. Drawing on Sylvia Wynter's formulation, Smith suggests that this period asks us to consider the implications of non-white people laying claim not to the plot, but to the plantation. Chapter 4 identifies the literary shaping of Black middle-class male aspiration in Robert Cobham's novels Rupert Gray and the Sword of Nemesis. It shows how the Black male protagonists in these texts gain ownership of the great house by marrying the last in line of an elite white Caribbean plantation family. Strolling in the Ruins invoke theme and disposition of the book, and I'll ask questions about this specifically later. In chapters 2 and 3, Smith examines strolling both as a form of knowledge production and as a contested site of colonial power. Working as a cop on the beat, Claude McKay's Strolling facilitates the performance of state surveillance and violence. Yet the Black women that are supposed to be his targets mobilize this moment of uncertainty about Black men's capacity to wield the law, to ridicule and publicly shame him. A similar dynamic takes place in Smith's analysis of the fictional exchange that takes place as English Countess Rothbury strolls in Trinidad's botanical gardens, bringing her into contact with Rupert Gray in Cobham's novel of the same name. Rothbury takes a picture of Gray, a gendered act that carries with it the racialized violence of empire, and highlights Smith's argument that visuality operates as an idiom through which these relations of power take shape. Yet rather than refuse this moment of capture, Gray uses it as an opportunity to befriend Rothbury in the bid for social advancement within the colonial order. Ruins, the second half of the title, is meant to refer not only to the detritus of history, but also to the process of ruining itself, especially in relationship to working class Black womanhood. Smith notes that the overt conflict between men across class and race lines conceals a shared investment in the vulnerability of Black women. And so even as Black middle-class men in Trinidad wrest ownership of the great house from the clutches of the white patriarch, Black women serve as a welcome reminder of the ignominy of enslavement. And even as white elites and increasingly educated and professional Black men in Jamaica compete for political power, they nevertheless agree on the right to peer into Black men's bedrooms, to witness and evaluate their intimate life. But while they may exist as sites of surveillance, Smith maintains that Black women's bedrooms can also function as loopholes of retreat, to use Tina Camp's term, for crafting practices of freedom. I have not nearly done justice to this book. Its nuance and complexity, and how it assembles a wide range of methods, subjects, theories, and objects across geography and discipline is stunning. This promiscuous book is bursting at the seams, and as it unfolds, it cracks open a line of doors in its wake, begging future scholars to pry open the new avenues of research to which they gesture. While there are many, I give one example here. In chapter 2, Smith discusses visuality as an idiom of colonial power. She contextualizes the photographic encounter that she analyzes between English Countess Rothbury and Trinidadian Rupert Gray by attending to how photography comes to bear on existing relations of power around race, class, gender at the turn of the century across the United States, England, Africa, and the Caribbean. For instance, she identifies how photography becomes an opportunity for women to make careers for themselves by magnifying white men's self-image as custodians of civilization. This is evidenced in the work of sisters Emmy and Mamie Gerard at the 1904 St. Louis World Fair, where they photographed members of groups including Inuit, Navajo, Chinese, and Igorot and Moro Nation Filipinos. It is at this photographic site that Smith identifies the points of exchange between different kinds of Blackness when social scientist Jean Price Mars visits the fair as one of Haiti's official representatives and is confronted by what he refers to as, quote, a group of Black Filipinos and presumably other African American attendees. I read this as a minor scene in Smith's chapter, but it opens up several avenues of research. How might Price Mars's reaction to these photographs provide an opportunity to consider a different relationship between anthropology and photography? How do American, Haitian, and Filipino grammars of Blackness interact at this moment? To what extent might American photography be a useful site through which to consider how Blackness figures in Haitian studies and Filipino studies? What would it mean to theorize Afro-Asian relations through Haiti and the Philippines? And is it necessary for the US to serve as the ground for this connection? I share these questions not because I want you to answer them, but simply to demonstrate how generative I found the text, even as I read these minor scenes in your book. So the first question that I like to ask is pretty simple. Can you tell me how the book came about, and specifically how it relates to your earlier works, Creole Recitations, and the edited volume Sex and the Citizen?
Okay, so I want to start by thanking both of you for welcoming me to this space. I want to tell you that I couldn't imagine better interlocutors for this work, because each of you, and now each of you separately and now together, have been so important for how I think and rethink contemporary literature, what it means to teach with integrity, what it means to kind of think through the 1950s across the Caribbean and so on. So I'm really happy to be here in this beautiful room. But I also want to acknowledge Professor Vinson. You've been to Brandeis. I wasn't there, but your poster, it's all over the corridor. You came to talk about South Africa. Professor Laurent Dubois. Obviously, it's lovely to get to know you now, but of course you are a big man in the kinds of things I'm trying to kind of think through. And someone is here from Undisciplining Victorian Studies. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Please say it so that the Zoom audience can hear. Yes. Yes, I just want to say how important. It's my graduate students who introduced me to the work that you've been doing at your sex. And it's been so formative. In fact, our English department is kind of refiguring how we think about how we do our pedagogy. And so that work is just crucial. So I'm very happy to be in the room with all of you. Okay, so I have to stop avoiding at some point. So my first book project was on a 19th century Trinidadian, John Jacob Thomas, a school teacher. And so let's say 1870s, 1880s I was in that book. I tried to show his relationship as a Black Trinidadian schoolmaster to Victorian life, kind of entanglement of Anglophone Caribbean life and kind of Victorian landscape. His relationship as a Black school teacher to two strands of cultural and also elite life in Trinidad, that is to say, a Francophone Trinidadian landscape and an Anglophone Trinidadian landscape, both of which are what we see in the middle to late, across the span of the 20th century, are at odds with each other. So what does it mean for him to be someone who clearly grew up speaking Trinidad Creole, which is a French dynamic, Francophone dynamic, and to be kind of making his way through trying to be consecrated in a kind of Anglophone intellectual sphere. So I was trying to think about that and what is Thomas's relationship to what he would have called a kind of global Ethiopic. Sometimes we use the word talented 10. So I'm trying to situate him in relation to all of these, but also as a respectable man in Trinidad, what is his relationship to working class people, working class women in particular. There's a moment when he derides Bim Bim, a Curacao woman who is doing terrible things with her pelvis in public. In other words, he's trying to think through what we would call Jamet culture and all the kind of sonic and performative apparatus that kind of accompanies that. And so as I was trying to figure out what to do after that, I thought that this was going to be a project on Marty and Furman. I was trying to figure out how to continue this kind of late 19th century. I hadn't gotten up to the 20th century, but I was trying to kind of make my way around that. So that didn't happen, but at the same time, I was thinking about Tuskegee. I thought there was going to be a chapter on Tuskegee here because I did a lot of work on that, but it never got to it. And so I was thinking about Caribbean people at Tuskegee and what those kinds of Tuskegee and Hampton and what those kinds of relationships meant, what it meant to kind of leave those institutions and go back to the Caribbean, because as I say in the essay you mentioned, in an interesting way, you know, there's a way in which we think of Booker T. Washington and others as the conservative side of the Du Bois element, and yet in a way, what institutions are doing are preparing Black students to thrive in a colonial system back in the Caribbean, because we condemn them, we condemn these figures like Washington for being colonial, and it's precisely that familiarity with how to placate and how to survive and how to navigate that makes these students then thrive back in the Caribbean. So in any case, I'm rooting around in that later 20th century, later 19th century, earlier 20th century, and in the process of that, finding particular kinds of things. And interested in photography in part because of Krista Thompson's first book, An Eye on the Tropics, where she's kind of looking at how the United Fruit Companies is responsible for the development of a certain kind of tourist culture and what that means. And so I'm even looking at the papers of I'm forgetting his name now, it's right there, Dow, whatever his name is, who inaugurates what becomes the United Fruit Company. But so I'm looking at his papers at the Baker Business School at Harvard, and his wife's, how she's talking about being in Portland and so on, and all of that doesn't make it in here, but I'm rooting around in that period. And then in 2014, of course, McKay is always there in my brain. And so I'm reading Pounding the Pavement, where he's talking about, he's using the first person to talk about basically walking the beat in Jamaica. And something tells me to just check what if he actually means himself, that he's at the halfway tree precinct in Kingston, and what if he's the eye of the short story is a policeman who is called by an elite couple in Kingston to come and tell the woman who works for them and who lives on the premises to come and sneak, basically to corral the constable to help them break into her bedroom because they believe her boyfriend is there with her. And so I checked the newspaper, and it turns out it's not McKay, but there's a case not in Kingston, but in South Lamar, Westmoreland, and it's a big case. And so what this leads me then to see is that what McKay is trying to tell us, or what McKay is helping me to read, is a landscape in which in Jamaica at least, the ruling classes are opening up. Very, very small apertures for Black political class to be elected instead of everybody being nominated. Like one at a time, two at a time, and they're having elections. But what they've worked out is that Black men who would be eligible for this and who would want this, that kind of lower middle and middle class, are also the sexual partners of women who would be working and living on the premises of these white elite Jamaicans. And so if you break into her room when her boyfriend is there, the man you're likely to catch, and it happened in this case, the man he was running for one of those elected positions. So it's showing you the relationship, the entanglement of sexuality, intimacy, political life, race, and so on. And McKay's story is helping me to read that. Like, what is the trauma of that? The guy goes on to win the case. As much as it's traumatic, she falls out of the story. So how is it traumatic for both of them? How does it register differently in a gendered way? I'm trying to map all of that, and his story is helping me to map that. So that's on one side. I'll just briefly finish up by saying, I was also then obsessed with one of the things that's happened in the early 21st century is that a lot of books published in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were lost to us, but then were, because of the work of a lot of scholars in the Caribbean, have been republished. And one of those is Stephen Cobham's Rupert Gray, A Tale in Black and White. And that's published in 1907. So that's really key
Yeah.
And so it's a novel that teaches me. It mentions the Boer War.
Yeah.
It mentions, photography. There's a scene in which he's being photographed. So it's telling me something about Caribbean people's right to stroll in the space, meaning no right to stroll in the space, at a moment when European and North American tourists, partly because of that, what's being set in motion by the United Fruit Company, are free to stroll and to take photographs and to do all these travel logs in that moment. And so what does it mean to live under that kind of new surveillance? Yeah. And part of what makes them free and empowered, at least on the North American side, is the fact that what becomes the Spanish-American War, but of course, Cuba and the Philippines thought that they were freeing themselves from Spain. Yeah. But what becomes the Spanish-American War and the triumph of US power now in another phase is empowering US business interests and so on to rampage through the region. Yeah. And so how is the novel teaching me to read that? And then finally, Gordon Roller, who has just left us, yeah. that fantastic chronicler of the archival, who has done so much archival work around Trinidad Carnival. Long ago, he would have given some of us a photocopied narrative of it's a kind of 1900 article about Trinidad that year. So February 1st, February 1900, every year there's Trinidad Masquerade, a Trinidad Carnival, and in the February 1900 one of the masquerades is the ongoing Boer War, like literally. Yeah. Hours after one of the generals surrenders on the battlefield in Southern Africa, Trinidadians are playing that in mass the next morning. And so what does that tell us about what it means to inhabit the gestures, to perform in Westmoreland, where my father's from? That's the year of Pretoria Day in June. All those mean parades, people on horseback. And so what does it mean to perform loyalty? Yeah. What does it mean that I want to read that loyalty as something else? Yeah. So in the book, I'm also working out my own desire to read for resistance all the time and for all these other things. And I'm trying to kind of figure that out. So that's my answer.
I think this is so, do you see what I mean when I say they're so wide ranging across geography and discipline? And so there's several things that you said just now that kind of dovetails into my next question. And it's about, because you're talking about, hey, I found this piece here, and then I became interested in this over here. And then and you talk about strolling. And I'm interested in how strolling becomes an object of study and a method for you, right? And you situate Delissa, this light-skinned Jamaican journalist, as trying to entice American and European tourists by saying, strolling is a modern form of movement. It marks the Caribbean because it's just hot, right? Like you should stroll. Right. But not everyone can stroll everywhere freely, right? And you show us that the legacy of the plantation in this post-abolition moment is that the past system in some ways is still in operation, right? And so it's interesting that you're focusing on strolling and not fleeing, right? When you think about the legacy of the plantation. Yeah. But so if strolling leaves one vulnerable, as in the case of McKay, who is dressed down by this, his encounter with this woman.
In a poem, one of his poems.
In one of his poems, can you talk about your relationship to strolling, creating this book? And I'm gonna so strolling is something that's kind of leisurely, casual, and informal, but this work is anything but that. It is like intensely rigorous scholarship, and it's a serious, prolonged, and meticulous engagement with archives across the Atlantic. But it also means that the reader is required to stroll, right? Like you can't rush through this text, right? Can you talk more about strolling as a method of knowledge generation, and what does it mean to idle, meander, and dawdle in the archives?
Thank you, that's lovely. So the first
And then
thing.
the second part of that question is,
That's
if
controversial.
if strolling renders one vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
How do you see when you're engaging, when you do this work?
Mhm.
How does that? What kind of vulnerabilities does that reveal for you? You know.
Don't know if I get to that, but so what the first thing I want to say, I guess, is that to use strolling as a heuristic there has both promise and limitations, precisely because it brings to mind the privilege of being able to slow down,
Right.
the privilege of having the space and the time to walk slowly and to look around, and therefore to do so without being apprehended and so on. The challenge there is that and I think that remains is that at those moments where it's clear that people don't have the opportunity to do that, then strolling in that sense then is in tension with what's going on. So you choose one thing knowing that it will work well here, but here, you know, you can argue for the dissonance, but it doesn't work as well somewhere else. In other words, any word that you choose is going to do that. And so I take responsibility for that. Certainly, so one thing to say too is that Strolling in the Ruins was for a long time, until quite recently, the chapter of the 1907 earthquake chapter.
Right.
So that was Strolling in the Ruins. So even there, strolling is not only privilege, but that's where I talk about Flannery, for example, and the inheritance of a certain kind of privilege mode. Well, privilege, not privilege mode of a disinterested or the aspiration to disinterest of the person who can wend their way through a boulevard. I mean, it's an important kind of site of that kind of modern narration, being able to be in the crowd, but not of the crowd, and therefore to narrate. There's a supermarket here, and so there's a way in which that gets that's I'm invoking it in that chapter because I'm trying to connect Caribbean narration of modernity and particularly of disaster. Because if you're a Caribbean narrator, one of the things that you have to contend with is the narration of disaster. So in fact, what Dillis is doing in that passage is it's after the earthquake, 1907 earthquake, and they've built back some of the things. And he's saying, well, here, what does it mean to walk through downtown Kingston? And you know, it might not look, hey, reader in Paris and New York, doesn't look like you're strolling, but you know what? It works for us because you have to slow down because the temperature demands it. In other words, if you come with your ways here, that's not going to work. And there's a whole tradition of Walcott and others speaking like that. We do our thing here because it has a logic here. So there's that. There's the whole business of the policeman and strolling, because then there's a menace in that, because there's the way that the state wants to tell us that the policeman on every block is a good thing for us, right? So you can call, you know, it's that idea of the policeman, the police officer working on behalf of the community, being there in case trouble happens. It could never be that person is the trouble, right? So that idea of strolling and being on the beat and patrolling as encapsulating things that in fact are pulling against each other. This idea of a caretaker, the person who's taking care of us and who is therefore on the beat to protect us, but actually the person who is producing criminality. And that's what we see with sex workers on the street. That's what we see with, this is the era, as I talk about, especially in that chapter, of the kind of ramping up of vagrancy laws. And part of the reason for that is, I mean, one is that it happened in 1902. There are Montego Bay demonstrations in 1902. There's an important, anyway, so part of the reason it happens in this era and that they're ramping up these laws is precisely to make sure that this rising class of Black men who have political aspirations can be put down. And so the man who is found in this young woman's bedroom, that's a charge that's placed against him, that he's in violation of the vagrancy law. And so in court, part of what they're arguing over is the fact that it's even harsher than its equivalent in England. UK, exactly, right? So again, Strolling, so that's the police aspect, the person on the beat, and you can see how McKay is trying to kind of think through how the Black constable, who is never going to go further, is embodying that person. He is of the community, and he is being wielded by the state, if you like, to enforce these things. So what is a feeling of embodying that and performing that? And I think all of McKay's oeuvre is in a way about that. And I'm trying in this moment to kind of think through how he's teaching us to read that first decade in the in When I Pounded the Pavement, which is that case that happens in 1910, as I show, but also in the poems he publishes. He publishes 2 books of poetry in 1912, 1911, the year before he leaves Jamaica, as it turns out, for good. And he's writing those poems at his desk in the Halfway Tree precinct, police precinct. So he's a poet policeman, right? So I'm thinking about that. And then, so there's that. And so then I might have used walking and what it means to walk and what it means to walk under duress as my heuristic, walking in the ruins. You know, that would have been perhaps more, that wouldn't have been weighted down by the idea of privilege and time and access and so on. And so another thing that you see in that chapter and elsewhere are the woman whose industry and use of know-how about capital and markets and space and resources has been at the backbone for centuries of the market system in all of across the Caribbean. And so, but in this era, the late 19th and the early 20th century, they are precisely the ones who are being stopped every minute for these photographs. So there's a whole thing of postcards of women with things on their head. Well, that means they have to stop. And so what does it mean to be the object of those photographs? And so so that's when I find Tina Camp's work, for example, very useful in trying to think about how the sitter is being corralled into something, conscripted into something. And so we must forget that, even as we understand that sitter's ability to, again, Camp would say resist. I don't know if it has to be resistant, but at least not to be completely the person is a person. And so she talks about the word she uses is tense. How do we read that encounter between sitter and the photographer as a kind of tense encounter? And how is it possible to read that baby on the face? But as I try to say throughout the book, I'm also looking at, I try to stress the ways in which my desire for something, you know, autonomy, whatever it is also at work here. And so in the chapter on photography, for example, it's my students, you know, I show my students photographs from this moment and I say, you see that? You know, they had to stand there and be photographed. And my students will say, but it's the only sign we have of that generation or something like that. Because they see something, I mean, you know, sure, you came in here with your thing to show us, but what we see are people of another generation who are standing up and looking at the camera. A friend of mine, I was thinking about people posed on donkeys in this moment, because that's
Yeah.
part of the trope too of non-modernity, et cetera, et cetera. Until a friend of mine pointed out, well, being photographed on a donkey means that you have a donkey.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
property. It's an important. It's actually very important. So again, that's the book then is for me part of a conversation of how to engage this archive, and therefore how to engage what we've inherited.
Right.
Yeah.
That is.
So that answers the my part.
Okay.
You asked about the personal part. That's
okay. All right. So I want to ask about, have two more questions. Actually, let me see which question I want to ask. Let's ask this question. So, so you know that you could have done more in discussing the Trinidad and Jamaica relations and also the Asian and Black racialization. And then you propose, and you say, oh, I didn't do it as much, but then, and then you propose adjacency as a way to consider them, right? So you situate adjacency, and this is on page 29, a way of thinking about how Cuban, Haitian, American, Ethiopian, Madrasi, South African, just few, and other identities inflect Trinidad, Jamaican, or British colonial ones. Can you expand on how you're thinking about adjacency to map out Trinidad, Jamaican, but also Black and Asian relations? And I'll give you just two spaces where I think that this could be done. One is when you talk about how the white American Ella Wheelock Wilcox takes photographs of Black and Indian women in Trinidad, or in your analysis of Herbert Lissa's novel Jane, you suggest that the way that Syrians and Chinese merchants in Jamaica cater to working class Black women in ways that larger and more established businesses do not, quote, and this is on page 86, cast both merchant and consumer as sharing a register of modernity we must learn to track. So just,
Thank you. So one thing that adjacency was getting me away from was comparison. For a long time, I'd worked with comparison, but comparison was too, I don't know if the word is limiting, but I realized I wasn't comparing these two colonies and putting them beside each other to say some things about them. And in some ways, they will line up, but in some ways, what they're doing, what they're each doing is so different that it doesn't require lining up. And so comparison was kind of out. And so adjacency was better to kind of, and so that list that includes Madrasi and Ethiopian and so on, is just a way of indexing. It's a reminder, for example, that sometimes when we narrate the story of our, when we're doing stories that are convened around the nation, sometimes the way that national narrative takes shape leaves out things. So for example, my mother is born in Cuba in the 1930s, and the family returns to Jamaica towards in the late 40s, in the late 30s. And that's because, all these, as Putnam's second book shows, all these territories are shutting down. Like we had you over here, you cut the cane. So now we have a purity narrative about the nation. The flip side of that, though, is that when we tell the story of Jamaica, for example, it doesn't always mean that that time in Cuba, you can see it if it will pop in here and there, but it kind of it disrupts a certain kind of narrative that coheres and makes sense when we talk about this is how the nation came to be. It kind of remains kind of geographically bounded or whatever it is. And so I was thinking about, and yet it's so obvious that if you think about Jamaican life, for example, Ethiopia and genealogies linked to Ethiopia and what Jamaicans what Jamaicans have made Ethiopia mean, right? In Jamaica and other places. That's part of the story of that nation. So I was just thinking about that. And so the adjacency worked for me as a way to kind of think them through together. the question, and so with Wheeler Cox, who is taking this photograph, and DeLisso, who has this 1913 novel about Jane, I guess that there, but for me, the other example would precisely be thinking about, I love the way you put it in your introduction, thinking about Firma in St. Louis, and it's not a photograph. He's at the booth of the Filipinos. In other words, there's a whole civilizational thing about people in their cultural whatever. And so the Philippines brings actually a large delegation, which in itself is about the hierarchies of groups in the Philippines, which is meant to show the ongoing success of what's just happened in the US. And so the group that he sees is at the box, at the base of that. And so so I was thinking about what it meant for he's looking at them, but they're looking at him. Exactly. And so of course it's a photographic opportunity for whoever is looking. But I was thinking about that. And so as I loved how you said, what would it mean to pursue that? And to therefore, what does he take back to Haiti in his head? And whether we follow that directly, or we we use critical fabulation to kind of think about how we tell the story of Haiti differently, and so on. That would be kind of interesting to kind of think through. In the work I was doing on Tuskegee, I'm interested in the fact that at least one student is a Japanese student at Tuskegee. And so what does it mean to kind of think about who goes to Tuskegee and who finds opportunities in Tuskegee in the early 20th century, right? What does it mean to track those down? With Jane and the Merchants, I've just been reading, and so my head is full of Dowley Goff's work on infrastructures of sound, which is fantabulous. It's a small essay, I'm going to say maybe in the last 3 years. And so she's doing the work that I aspire to do in that direction, which is what does it mean to kind of think through the shop of the migrant subject as a place of sociality, a place of generosity, and also not generosity, a place of exchange, all kinds of exchanges. What does it mean to think of that grocery shop, or in this case, clothing shop, as an important site at different periods of Caribbean life? Right. So she does that work there with the because she talks about how the grocery shop throughout Jamaica, operated by Chinese Jamaicans, is the place where the sound system is going to be important. And so therefore that's where we're going to look for the sound of modernity. That's where you're going to look for the development of the sound system, and so on and so forth. So
Thank you for that. I'm just gonna ask one more question before we turn it to the audience. So one is, I'm interested in the relationship.
One more question. One
more. I have another one, but I'm going to. I'll ask you afterwards. But so
or ask both, and then was it both? Was it two?
It was two, but you know what? It's all right.
Just put both on the table.
All right. So all right. So one is the relationship between trace and ruin as noun and verbs, right? So as nouns, they both function as subjects or objects of study. They're the evidence that we're supposed to look at, right? But trace in Jamaica is not. It's not like tracing a diagram. It's to like cut off something, right? And so as verbs, they function as forms of critique and control and regulation. And so in many ways, they're punitive. And so we can collapse them, right? So what gets left behind in the aftermath of a tracing or a ruining, and that becomes historical evidence. And so can you talk more about the relationship between trace and ruin as verbs and nouns in your work, and how even as you analyze tracing, you're also tracing yourself, like you're also engaging in forms of critique?
Wow, that's lovely. I mean, I feel like I just wanted to stand there and ask for the other question, but I guess I'd briefly say that I love the way that you frame this, and so what's coming to mind just immediately is the fact that both of those, both of those with a double edge to both of those, each of them, kind of come. My memory is that they're most evident in when I'm discussing the poem Midnight Woman and Bobby by McKay, because he's using his right the persona of the poem is using his right to apprehend her. We could surmise because she's refusing what he feels is his entitlement to sexual favors as a constable, and for the whole poem, it is the constable who is narrated as being the object of her abuse. He's the one who's being abused, right?
To trace him out,
right? The whole thing is like, you think you're a policeman in that jacked up uniform, and you think these authorities trust you, and you come from Clarendon where there's drugs. I know what's going on in Clarendon, but what is she anyway, it's like a whole, she's just like turned him inside out in the Colonial sense, right? Except here, it's not the white woman and her child on the train in Paris is one of the own, and it's a woman, right? So what does it mean? So walking in the streets is being narrated here as perilous for him. At the same moment where, as I've tried to show throughout, very often and very often sympathetic or hostile narrators script themselves in part because he has to recuperate himself. That's the policeman and the poet. They have to recuperate the shame of what's happened, especially because it's happened at the hands of a woman. And so narration is one way. The power to narrate and to have it published seems to me is one way to think about that recuperation. That in this sense, with all its vulnerabilities too, you get to narrate yourself as on the receiving end of these loud, boisterous women on the street. And so the fact that she's unprotected, the fact that she is at his mercy, she knows she can be thrown into jail and sexually abused as well. All of that is displaced, it seems to me, by the fact that she uses her kind of verbal power to undo him. And so I guess we could say that part of the work here is to figure out how ruins are sometimes physical, as in the aftermath of an earthquake, as in the aftermath of a war. Sometimes they're physical and sometimes they're not physical. And so the work becomes how to figure out how to do justice to those traces, so how to do justice to the many facets of ruination. She's ruined, right? And how do you do justice to that as a researcher who is trying to not give her humanity, which is completely problematic too, but to understand that she is a subject in her own right. And so I think that work, I find that work difficult. Because I'm also a subject in time and space with my own issues. And so learning to, and so part of the process of doing that is to be engaged in the reading and the conversations with others that helps us do better work. I guess is how I would answer that.
Thank you. I'll save my last question and open it up to the audience. So are we for the, okay,
But please feel free to, yeah. And so you keep on raising.
sure. Can we have 1 and 2?
And can
wanna
you
go
say your
first?
name?
Yes, can you say your names, please?
Sure, Dr. Smith. Hi, Robert Trent Benson. I have the book.
Oh,
I
thanks.
not had a chance to obviously to go through it. I'm so interested in Strolling, the title, and the subtitle non-sovereign modern. I'm struck by the National Caribbean and South Africa chapter,
Mhm.
and it immediately makes me think. Working with this idea of sovereign in the context of how it's meant traditionally in Western conflict, settler colonialism, domination, and how those who are subjected to that sovereignty leverage elements of that
Mhm.
to articulate a non-sovereign modernity, whatever that might be. And I'm thinking about Anglophone Caribbean
Mhm.
folk in early 20th century South Africa, and how they are leveraging a claim of British imperial subjecthood
Mhm.
to be able to establish themselves by property, establish themselves as stevedores, to have economic security, and form broadly pan-Caribbean Anglophone communities that ultimately are the basis of ideas that develops there later to articulate a different kind of sovereignty. And I'm thinking about Zulu, to start very quickly.
Yeah.
How diasporic Blacks are leveraging ideas of Zulu nationality, that type of sovereignty, that type of Black nationality and anti-colonial resistance, to carve out space to speak against other forms of sovereignty, particularly in the US, let's say. And how that shows up in Black history movements that valorize the Zulu state as an example of Black nationality, emulated in some ways. And I'm thinking about the Zulu Social Aid and Pleasure Club
In New Orleans.
and thinking about the term strolling the ruins, strolling during Mardi Gras.
Right.
You can think about New Orleans as a site of ruination.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
And even now,
Today.
Katrina,
Yeah.
right? And how the Zulu, in this case, are the sardonic irony of the commentary and how they are displaying themselves, how they are sort of referencing against various forms of segregation. And so just playing with that, thinking
Yes,
about
I
it,
love it.
and without having read, the book,
Yes.
I'm wondering how we work with this, how you think about this in reading.
Right.
I just offer that
Yeah.
because it just has that in my mind.
It's very powerful, and I appreciate that so much. It's already expanded what's here for me, and I love that in at least two different sites, in Southern Africa in the early 20th century, and then in the kind of early 20th century, but also long history of New Orleans. So I love this strolling because then it puts the masqueraders beside the Trinidad masqueraders, for example. When I get to New Orleans very briefly, it's not to talk about masquerade, but to talk, although I refer to it, but it's to talk about the ownership. It's to talk about in effect. Anyway, it's to talk about the ownership of a club at that moment and the fact that so many groups in this country and around the world are taking on the word Zulu. And so what does it mean in that moment, 1909, what's going on in Southern Africa? What does it mean in that moment to just even use that label? So I'm trying to think through that. But now you've returned me to masquerade and strolling in New Orleans itself as a thing to put beside Trinidad. So I really appreciate that. I'll just say very quickly that in addition to what you've just said, non-sovereign I'm specifically referencing Yarimar Bonija's use of it to kind of think through. So she's a scholar of Puerto Rico working on Guadeloupe, among other places. And so she's basically turning to those of us who have flag independence. And she's saying, you think you're it? Flag? Look, we're all non-sovereign together. Here are the different ways. You have a flag, we have this, we have that, but guess what? We're all non-sovereign in these different ways. I find that extremely, extremely generative. And so I'm trying to kind of think, if that is the case, then instead of narrating in terms of who gets where first, and so on, as in this, the ways in which we tend to kind of think about trajectories of nationhood and independence and so on. If we're thinking about a project that designed one way, we're always going to be engaged in that in our different and collective ways. Then in this little moment, like 1890-ish to 1910-ish, what does that mean? What does that mean? And so that's where that term comes from. I love what you've just given me right here for expanding that even further. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good
My
afternoon.
name is Amber Henry. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at Woodson. I just finished my PhD last spring at UPenn in anthropology, where I was with my Deborah Thomas.
Oh, wow. Oh, my gosh.
I have two questions, one about non-sovereignty,
Yeah.
and the other about this wonderfully generative category and Emily given us strolling. So I was really attracted to the notion of the vocabulary of sovereignty and this notion of thinking of imperial power as more than white, dominant civilizational caste, page 8, or an interest in royalty who are other than kind of this white European royalty. So I'll preface this by saying that I work with Maroon populations in Colombia, where we have the same narrative of the Palenque being formed by Prince Benko Fiojo, who came from the Bight of Medina in Africa and founded the Maroon community, and how that language of sovereignty and royalty is replicated in ways that are used for the purposes of also like poking holes.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
And I'm curious whether you might connect this beautiful category of adjacency to sovereignty and think about whether what is happening is a sort of adjacent sovereignty, right? And especially kind of building on Yarimar Bonija's work in now the Anglophone Caribbean. How does your work then kind of nuancing this concept of non-sovereignty, continuing the vernacular definitions, but maybe also connecting it with adjacency?
Thank you. Yes. So one way that I would address that would be to think about, well, certainly the way I was doing it there would be to think about how that faith and delight in royal titles and royal identities, regal identities, is a kind of adjacent, is a kind of adjacent sovereignty, as you usefully put it here, that we have. It seemed to me we've tended to, at least in my sense of it, to condemn as it's part of the inflated, problematic faith in empire. Yes. That when we look back at that moment. So one of the things I was trying to deal with in that moment is my own impatience with that moment. So in the book, I'm trying to work through my own impatience. It's like, really? Yeah, exactly. It's like really? No, I'm saying in the early 20th century moment, It's like, really, you king? That's what you're coming up with, Duke? In the, that's what I've grown up kind of learning to think about that moment. And so the real thing begins in the 20s and 30s when we have another vocabulary, and it's about that. It's anti-imperialism. And that's how the story can begin. Or before that, when enslaved people or in the post-abolition period, as in 1865, 1888, the right to take the Tajas all the way to the river, or to, what happens in Stony Gut in 1865. That's real that's countering the state. When you use Prince and all of that, and they're claiming that doesn't sound the same. Yeah. And so that to me is part of why the period is problematic, because it's not doing the things that we from the future, when we're looking back, that's not the kind of thing that we're promoting here. So how could that be? Like what's going on there? And so I'm trying to understand what it means to use that language of power, and to see it not as mimicry, to see it as more in a more capacious way than to just say they're mimicking or they're doing this, but also without falling into the trap of saying, well, they're being revolutionary, you know what I mean? Which is the go-to. And so what's the space in between those things? That's what I'm trying to teach myself to do, and to teach myself to do in a way that makes sense and that will hold. And the success of that comes with multiple conversations. This is joining an ongoing conversation, and we help each other do that better. I love this idea of, I think you said, I can't read my writing, so who knows, but I like this idea of, I think you said something like adjacent sovereignty to poke holes at the sovereignty itself, or something like that.
Kind of modern, what Robert was talking about would be kind of a sovereignty based in genocide, dispossession, violence,
right?
Colonialism.
Yes.
Yes.
I hope that I answered some of what you asked.
Yes, certainly.
Okay.
And then just quickly to turn to now Strolling.
Oh yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay. This is so helpful in my own work, and I love especially the kind of the echo that you painted between the patrolling of the beats and that kind of strolling, and then tourists who are strolling, very leisure type of movement. But I'm wondering, going back to Tina Camp's work, listening to images, if there is a version of strolling that allows us to see something else, allows us to see evasion, allows us to see moving as a way of practicing what Tina Camp refers to as fugitivity. So she has this fantastic section where she's thinking about even the taking of passport photos as a fugitive act from post-colonial subjects who were never supposed to be able to move anyway, right? Exactly. So how might your concept of strolling open up understanding, if at all, to fugitive forms of movement in urban spaces? Thank you.
Thanks. So one way would just be to kind of think about the way it comes across to us is the travel, the narrators of travel writing, talking about, it used to be that you could just go and take a photograph, and now these natives want money. You know, it's like, really gonna charge me to come from outside and take money? So there's a whole world of interaction going on there, and if we would extend it, we could think about, you know, if somebody is driving you somewhere, then how, you know, who is to say that, you know, you're being driven to the right place, or, you know, at the end of the day, you are at the mercy of the person in whose vehicle you are. And so there are all kinds of ways, I think, in which those things were happening. This is a period of Bedwood, Alexander Bedwood in Jamaica, and a lot of people are going to his to Augusttown to be baptized. and to share in his kind of millenarian view of the world. This is in colonial Jamaica. And so that movement where, and there's a moment where he says, you know, we're going to be taken up on such and such a day. So give away your worldly possessions and so on. I think this is going on. Well, we know this is going on all over. And so that movement, which is running counter to what the state wants it to do, which is to be cheap, a pool of cheap labor here and there to pay hot taxes wherever you are in the world, some version of that, right? That is counter to what the state wants from you. So this is going on in all kinds of ways. I would just add that in my coda, and this has reference to the cover, I refer to a video of, the artist Magdalena Campos Pons takes us to Matanzas. So she grew up in an estate in Cuba. And there's something about the way that she strolls through this. She's literally strolling through a ruined estate, but she remembers it as a site of sociality with her neighbors. So for her, yes, it's ruined, but ruined. So what she helps us think about is it's ruined in the sense of the productive capacity of sugar cane. For her, it's a space that formed her and where her neighbors still live. And so strolling through the ruins then in that sense is not ruinous. If you see what I'm saying? And so there's always we always have to contend with, if not foreground, and I don't foreground it. So this is also a lesson for myself. We always have to contend with the ways in which people understand their situation as oppressive, and in their daily life, they figure out how to navigate that in ways that we're still kind of coming to terms with, because they're leaving something. It might not be material for those who come after, and that's always happening. It's why we're here. And so how do we kind of catch up to the complexity of that? That's what I'm trying to do. Yeah. So. Hello.
I was really interested in, I think I understand that you said about performing loyalty. And I just wanted to hear more what you had to say about us. Kind of those representations, you know, that I myself like the carnival, and I don't think I see much of that today. So I also wanted to get your opinions on what you think about performance masquerade,
Thank you. So then we could ask in the contemporary moment, since particularly in Jamaica, but you work in a site which is non-sovereign in a particular way. So dancehall culture, which you work on, in fact, we could say is a site of not performing loyalty, and that's why it's always being hit, even as the world knows the region for that, right? But it's continually being hit for not performing loyalty, for being rude, right? And so then we could ask, performing loyalty to what? In other words, how might contemporary music teach us to kind of think about loyalty to something else, to some other vision of what it means to be in the world? In the book sense, what I was thinking through was that there are two calypsos in particular, in 1900, and one of them is 1900 or 1901. In other words, every year Trinidad produces a roster of calypsos. So I haven't caught up to this year's yet, but every year that's generated around Carnival time. And so in that year, two of them were about, you know, look at what Queen Victoria, look at what we're doing in the world, meaning via the Boer War. Look how we're beating those Boers, right? Good for us. And so again, I'm trying to deal with, okay, is that a performance of loyalty? On the face of it, it is. I, Faith Smith, want to, I'm in literature, so our thing is irony. So it must be ironic. Loyalty, when it says love, it must mean this, it's dissonant. We have all the vocabulary for what we desire to see. But sometimes, hey, maybe it was. But there are all kinds of things going on too. When you read Roller about how the form of music itself was changing, and so there's a whole thing about eighth tone, and there's a whole fight going on about the sound and the percussive and the kind of rhythm and meter of calypso, and so these songs are also doing that. In other words, if you limit yourself to words, there are all kinds of things opposite that you're missing, as or sonic sonic priestesses will tell us, right? You can't just look at the word. That's almost not, it's almost besides the point. The other thing though that I was thinking of, but then one of the songs talks about climbing Majuba Hill. And so when I looked into it, that refers to a moment 2 decades earlier when in fact the Boer won a battle. And so if you're climbing Majuba Hill, is that song digging at the British, or is it, you know what I mean? Or is it saying we lost it then, or let's do it now? And then, as it turns out, in Trinidad, one of the dissident groups in the city was the Laventille Boers. They call themselves Boers. Now, is that about loving Africana people, or is that about joking the British and saying, oh, that's your enemy? That's what we can call ourselves, right? So there are all kinds of ways to kind of read along the lines, and we also have to have the humility to know that the people in that contemporary moment have all these other resonances that I'm not getting to, because I'm using particular newspapers, I'm reading in English, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Are there any questions on Zoom?
Oh.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
The second one.
Well, okay, sure. So can you talk a little bit more about how race and gender operate in the book, especially in relation to Black womanhood? Because, you describe how Black women are vulnerable to ruin, or their presence functions to ruin others. They stain others, as you mentioned. But then you identify the way that women have the capacity to trace, right? And then their spaces can be understood as loopholes of retreat.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking about what this means for where Black women are historically at this moment. And in reading Brathwaite's work about social stratification in Trinidad, maybe in the 1940s, but he talks about how opportunities for social advancement for working class Black women are so limited compared to men. And how this supports a kind of dependence on, unless you're light skinned, and then maybe you can get a job in a shop, and how this supports a kind of dependence on the men that further exacerbates vulnerability to ruin. But then there's also this narrative that situates women as a matriarch, right, of these poor households in a way that middle and upper class women don't have the same kind of power in their households, supposedly, right? And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about these dynamics that identify both vulnerability and sites of power, and the tension between that as that. So for example, the Catherine Stewart, the female butler who's turned out of the house, and I'm wondering, wow, for her to get this kind of job, as you mentioned, it's such a, it's not easy, it's a privilege, it's an elite family. You have your own space that, it's easier than other kinds of things where you're not on the street, you're not traveling back and forth. But then she's also surveilled, right? So can you talk just like, can you tease out a little bit more of this kind of both sides?
So I did this I tried to do this, but so whenever I did this, it would be following some specific examples. So
Right.
just to go with two of them. So let's think about her in her room, and then let's think about the estate. So in two novels that I discussed, well, in one in particular, I was interested in the fact that these novels are ostensibly about protagonists who are not white. Are they Black protagonists? One is, but certainly they're Black and what would have been called brown or colored, right? And so it's a fictional representation early in the 20th century of people who own property, who have estates, and their neighbors are white, and they're not white. And so it's this idea of a rising Black middle class and a middling brown class that can inherit an estate. What does it mean to think about inheritance? But what interested me in one of the novels in particular is that that somehow the logic of the fiction always has a problem when the embodied person is a Black heiress. Somehow the novel couldn't he's Black, or let's say he's at least brown. Because one thing I do, and I'll get a lot of critiques for, is how I collapse these things. But so somehow in his body he can be an estate owner, even as he's turned out of it. And the whole plot of the novel is to get him back his estate. Yeah. But she falls apart. Yeah. And so what is it about her female personhood, her female non-white personhood, that cannot carry forward a narrative in which she's the head of the estate? Yeah. So one of the ways to understand that, I think, is to kind of trace through all the scholarship that helps us kind of think about, again, it's helpful, but is there a way that it also elides, obscures all these other things? And that's the extent to which certainly the history of enslavement in the Americas is that the Black rooms bequeath non-freedom, non-inheritance. How does that help us? And to what extent does that not allow us to see other things? Because it's obviously not the whole story. Yeah. And so that's partly what I'm juggling with when it comes to elite, at least the women at the elite level. The other thing at the elite side would be that question of the extent to which you can be middle class and a woman in a society that values whiteness and white femininity. So you're not a white woman, and you're not a working class Black or South Asian woman. And so therefore, what does it mean to be you in that moment? And what are the societal kind of expectations and also societal assumptions attached to that body? Yeah. And how can we understand women at all of these levels also subject to prevailing ideas about representing the group, being responsible for kind of biologically reproducing the group and being responsible for its futurity and so on. And so therefore, what kind of person do you have to be relative to your male identified corresponding subject, and so on and so forth. And so that question of the way that working class women are certainly vulnerable and certainly at risk of all kinds of things, including accusations of immorality from women at other levels. Yeah. But at the same time, there's also, I mean, do we call it freedom, or is that giving her too much? Yeah. There's a way in which there are certain things that she has access to and can do that the
Yeah.
corresponding women don't have, except that we often then romanticize. So for
Yeah.
me, the
Yeah,
classic thing that plays this out would be White Sargasso That's 1966, but it's talking about the 1840s, where that novel deeply, deeply romanticizes the Christophine figure, who is, after all, the last time we see her, she's trying to flee from being jailed for being an Obeah woman.
Yeah.
At the same time, there's a moment in that novel where we see her sitting in front of her own house in the woods, right? And so that's her own.
That's the house in the woods that you talk. That's similar to the house.
That's her own. That's her own space, and that's something that Antoinette never has, because white womanhood is such that she cannot be her. She's about enriching whiteness, so she can't have her own property. You know what I mean? So how can we tell that story about Christophine's freedom without forgetting that Christophine is at the mercy of all these other things?
People.
That's the continuing struggle. Yeah.
Okay.
So
This is really great. Want to respect your time, so we do have to end here and give Professor Smith.
Thank you very much.
Join us next door for lunch. There's books in the back. Please purchase. Give Professor Smith some time to catch her breath. And then next door, you can probably ask her to sign and ask her more questions that you have.
Yes,
Didn't get to. But thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.
Everybody on Zoom, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great job.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, either next before next. It's how the book.
Okay, so I have to.